Most people think retirement becomes simple once the math works. Once the spreadsheet says yes. Once the number looks big enough. Once you cross that invisible line where your investments can theoretically support you. But that's not when retirement gets easier. That's when it gets dangerous. Because the moment the math works, human behavior steps in, and almost no one is prepared for that part. If you've ever wondered why people with enough still feel anxious, still second-guess retirement, or quietly run into trouble years later, this is the missing explanation. And if you're close to your number, this may be the most important thing you hear. Let's start with a belief almost everyone carries. If I can live off the interest, I'll be fine. On the surface, that sounds responsible, smart even. It feels conservative. You're not touching principal, you're letting the engine run. And mathematically, under certain assumptions, it works. Markets grow, inflation averages out, withdraw less than returns. In theory, the money lasts indefinitely. That's the logic many people use to decide they're ready. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Very few retirements fail because the math was wrong. They failed because the assumptions quietly break. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, emotionally, socially, and usually right after the person feels safe. Because once the math works, behavior changes. Let me show you how. Imagine someone who spent decades saving. They were disciplined, they delayed gratification, they lived below their means, they watched balances grow year after year. Eventually, they hit a number that feels different, not just bigger, final, a number that makes them think, okay, I think we're good. That sense of relief is powerful, and it's deserved, but it also lowers their guard. They stop thinking like accumulators. They start thinking like owners, and ownership changes how money feels. During accumulation, every dollar feels fragile, hard to earn, easy to lose. After the finish line, money starts to feel durable, stable, replaceable. That emotional shift is the first crack in the plan, because the math that works forever assumes something very specific. It assumes discipline never weakens. It assumes spending decisions remain purely logical. It assumes withdrawals follow rules, not feelings. It assumes life politely stays inside the spreadsheet. That's never how real retirement works. Here's where things start to drift. At first, nothing dramatic happens. No big splurge, no reckless decision, just small, reasonable choices. A slightly nicer trip, helping someone once, saying yes because we can afford it. Each decision feels harmless. After all, you're not touching principal. You're still living off the interest. The balance barely moves, so the behavior gets reinforced. This is important. The most dangerous spending in retirement doesn't feel dangerous. It feels responsible. It feels kind. It feels earned. And because nothing immediately breaks, the mind rewrites the rules. The question quietly shifts from, is this in the plan, to, can we afford this? That single shift changes everything. Because can we afford it is almost always yes in isolation. But retirement doesn't fail in isolation. It fails cumulatively. Now layer in something else no spreadsheet models well: other people. The moment you're perceived as set, the world reacts differently to you. Sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, but always psychologically. When people believe you have plenty, your money stops feeling like your money, even to you. Requests start small. Expectations creep in. Generosity becomes assumed instead of optional. And here's the trap. You don't experience these moments as financial decisions. You experience them as emotional ones. You're not choosing to raise your withdrawal rate. You're choosing to help, to be supportive, to avoid awkwardness, to avoid guilt. No one says, this will increase our long-term risk. They say, it's just this once. And because the math used to work, it feels safe to bend it. This is where the illusion of living off interest begins to crack, because real withdrawals don't come labeled. Money is fungible. The account doesn't care why you took it. The market doesn't reward good intentions. A dollar withdrawn for generosity behaves the same as a dollar withdrawn for spending, but emotionally, they feel worlds apart. Now pause for a second. This is the moment most people miss. The problem isn't that retirees don't understand math. It's that math doesn't account for how humans behave after relief sets in. And relief is dangerous, because relief tells you the work is done. Let's talk about timing. If there's one period retirement plans are most vulnerable, it's early retirement. Those first years matter more than most people realize. Market returns early on matter more. Spending decisions early on matter more. Mistakes early on compound longer. And ironically, this is when retirees feel the most confident. They're healthy, they're active, they're generous, they finally feel free. Which means this is when extra spending, extra help, and extra flexibility tends to happen. Not because people are careless, because they're happy. And happiness loosens rules. Here's the quiet contradiction. The same optimism that makes retirement enjoyable is the same optimism that erodes its margin of safety. And this is where the average return logic quietly misleads people. Averages smooth reality. Life doesn't. Returns don't arrive evenly. Expenses don't follow scripts. Withdrawals don't politely pause during downturns. When someone says, on average, this should work, they're not wrong. But on average assumes you don't increase spending during emotional moments. It assumes you don't help more when asked. It assumes you don't normalize a higher lifestyle. And most importantly, it assumes you don't feel pressure from being perceived as wealthy. Now here's a critical point. None of this requires bad markets to go wrong. That's what makes it dangerous. You don't need a crash. You don't need inflation spikes. You don't need catastrophe. You just need a slow drift away from the original structure. That's it. Now let's reset for a second. Because if you're watching this thinking, okay, but I'm disciplined, this won't apply to me, this next part is exactly for you. Here's the uncomfortable reality. The people most vulnerable to this are the careful ones. The planners, the disciplined savers, the thoughtful retirees. Why? Because they trust themselves. They've earned that trust. They've made good decisions for decades. So when they bend the rules slightly, it doesn't feel risky. It feels earned. But structure doesn't care about your track record. It only cares about consistency. Let's talk about the idea of never touching principle. In theory, it sounds ideal. In practice, it's rarely how retirement unfolds. Even if you plan not to, there will be years where withdrawals exceed returns. That's normal. The problem isn't touching principle. The problem is doing it unintentionally, repeatedly, and emotionally. When withdrawals creep up without being acknowledged as plan changes, when generosity isn't budgeted, when flexibility isn't bounded, when spending decisions aren't revisited, that's when the engine starts losing efficiency. And engines don't fail instantly. They run hotter, they wear faster, they lose margin. By the time the issue is visible, the options are fewer. This is why the phrase, "the money will last forever," is so dangerous. Not because it's mathematically impossible, but because it invites complacency. It turns a structured plan into a vague hope, and hope is not a strategy. Here's another thing math rarely captures well: identity. When you stop working, your identity shifts, your role changes, your relationships change, and money quietly fills the gaps. You become the stable one, the successful one, the lucky one. That identity brings pressure, not always spoken, often internal. Pressure to help, pressure to share, pressure to not appear selfish. And this pressure doesn't show up as a line item. It shows up as discomfort, as hesitation to say no, as rationalizations. You start telling yourself, it's not that much. We're still okay. We'll adjust later. Later is the most expensive word in retirement because later removes urgency. Now, let me be clear. None of this means generosity is wrong. None of this means helping family is a mistake. None of this means retirement should be lived in fear. It means generosity must be structured. Unstructured generosity is one of the fastest ways to break an otherwise sound plan, and almost no one talks about that. Here's the real gap between math works and retirement works. Math assumes stable behavior, consistent rules, no emotional overrides. Retirement reality includes guilt, pressure, love, expectations, optimism, fatigue. That's the missing layer, and until you account for it, the plan is incomplete. Let's do a short reset here. If all you take from this video is one idea, it's this. Retirement doesn't fail because people don't save enough. It fails because they don't protect the structure after they save enough. Now let's talk about what protecting that structure actually looks like. First, clarity. Not just knowing your number, knowing your rules. What is your sustainable withdrawal range? What is already allocated for generosity? What flexibility is built in and what isn't? If generosity is important to you, it needs a line item, not a feeling. Second, boundaries, especially psychological ones. You don't need to justify your decisions with numbers. You don't need to explain your balance. You don't need to invite others into the math. The more people know, the more assumptions form, and assumptions are expensive. Third, intentional friction. Retirement plans need speed bumps, pauses before big decisions, conversations before helping, rules that slow you down when emotions are high. Friction isn't a restriction, it's protection. The retirees who do best long-term aren't the ones with the highest returns. They're the ones who preserve margin. They treat their portfolio like an income engine, not a pile of money. They understand that every unplanned withdrawal has ripple effects. They respect early retirement years as fragile, not forgiving. And most importantly, they resist the illusion that enough means invincible, because enough is only enough if behavior stays aligned. Let me leave you with this. Hitting your number is an achievement. You should feel proud. You should feel relieved. But relief is not the end of the process. It's the beginning of a new one. A phase where psychology matters more than spreadsheets, where structure matters more than averages, where protecting what you built becomes more important than proving you have it. The quiet truth is this. The most successful retirements are boring on paper, but very intentional in real life. They don't rely on optimism, they rely on guardrails. And once you understand that, you stop asking, is this enough? And you start asking the better question, is this protected? That question changes everything.